Bodies floated among the waves, bloated and silent. On the shore, the scent of gunpowder clung to the wind, tangled with the sickly sweetness of burning flesh and salt.
We heard a screaming aircraft, and moments later, a terrible explosion.
Screams had long faded, but the rocks still bled. It wasn't war anymore. It was something older, something colder. Okinawa didn't fall. It was carved open, slowly, deliberately. A grave made for everyone and no one.
The Japanese realize U.S. Navy aircraft carriers are still out there and are still dangerous.
This island was supposed to be the final step before peace, but instead it became a warning. A place where the earth itself seemed to whisper, "Not this way." And the world listened. Too late. Before the fire fell. By the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific was tilting sharply in favor of the Allies. The tide that had once carried Japanese forces across the ocean was now pulling back, hard, bloody, and slow. The dark days after Pearl Harbor were over. The Japanese empire, once seemingly unstoppable, was beginning to crumble. Island by island, the Americans were closing in. But with each step forward, the war grew more violent, more personal, and more desperate. The question no longer was whether Japan would lose. It was how far they would go before they accepted defeat, and how many would have to die before they did. In the great offices of power, Washington, Pearl Harbor, and San Francisco, men stared at maps. They spoke in calm voices and made cold calculations. They knew the war needed to end. They just didn't know how. Three paths stood before them. They could strike at the Chinese mainland. They could land on Formosa, now called Taiwan. Or they could take Okinawa, a long, narrow island that looked like nothing special on a map, but in reality was everything. Okinawa was close to Japan, close enough to fly bombers, to stage an invasion, to crush what was left of Japanese resistance. It was the final step before the homeland, but it wasn't chosen right away. As early as May 1944, American commanders were arguing over the next move. Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur had different visions. Nimitz leaned toward Formosa. It had ports, airfields, and a position perfect for strangling Japan's supply lines. MacArthur wanted the Philippines. He had promised to return, and for him, that promise was personal. President Franklin Roosevelt brought them together. He listened, he waited, and then he sided with MacArthur. The Philippines would come first, then Okinawa.
To the people of the Philippines whence I came, I shall return.
Behind that decision lay more than strategy. It was about pride, memory, legacy, but it would shape the road ahead. While the Allies pushed through the Philippines in late 1944, their forces also moved across the Central Pacific. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam had fallen. Airstrips were built, and soon B-29 bombers were roaring toward the Japanese mainland. Tokyo burned beneath the bombs, but it still wasn't enough. Fighters couldn't fly far enough to protect the bombers. Ships couldn't sail close without being in danger. The Americans needed a forward base, a strong one. And there was only one place that made sense: Okinawa. It was more than just an island. It was a wedge between Japan and China, a chain of land surrounded by water deep enough for fleets and wide enough for airfields. It was the gateway. And if it fell, Japan's last door would be open. The Japanese saw it too. From their command posts, they watched the Allies advance. They had lost their outer line of defense, the islands they had captured during their early victories. Now they were falling back on their final positions. The homeland, the heart, and to protect it, they would turn Okinawa into a shield. The planning began early. They moved troops to the island. Engineers were ordered to build defenses, not on the beaches, but in the hills. They studied the land, mapped the ridges, dug deep into the coral rock. They weren't preparing to win. They were preparing to hurt, to make the Americans suffer for every inch. By late 1944, the decision was made. Operation Iceberg. That was the name the Allies gave it. A name that sounded cold, distant, but what it unleashed was anything but. The goal was simple: take Okinawa, build airfields, and prepare for the final invasion of Japan itself. To do that, the Americans gathered one of the largest fleets in history, over 1,300 ships, thousands of planes, nearly 200,000 soldiers, Marines, and sailors. It was a floating city of war, pointed at a small island that most Americans had never heard of. The Japanese gathered too. They brought in their 32nd Army, tens of thousands of men. They dug tunnels, built bunkers, trained civilians, prepared suicide boats and kamikaze planes. They knew they couldn't stop the invasion, but maybe, just maybe, they could make it too costly to continue. In the final months before the battle, the sea grew dark with submarines. Bombers flew overhead, snapping photographs, dropping test bombs. Navy ships circled like wolves. And on the island, deep beneath the surface, Japanese soldiers waited for the storm, for the fire, for the end. The Americans believed they were one step away from peace. But in Okinawa, the war had only just begun. The island of no escape. Okinawa did not look like the center of the world. It wasn't big, it wasn't famous, just a long, narrow island stretching like a bent finger in the middle of the sea. But by 1945, every ship, every bomber, every soldier in the Pacific seemed to be looking straight at it. It sat between Japan and the wide waters of the Pacific. To the north, the Japanese homeland. To the south, the Philippine Sea and the edge of China. It was close enough for bombers to strike Japan, close enough for fleets to launch an invasion, close enough to matter more than any place had before. For the people who lived there, life had been simple before the war. Most Okinawans were farmers, fishermen, and teachers. They raised pigs, grew sweet potatoes, and lived in quiet villages with names that would later become battlefields. They had their language, their own culture, and for a long time they were neither fully Chinese nor fully Japanese, just Okinawan. Then came the empire, then came war, and with it, the island's slow death. The Japanese military had turned Okinawa into a fortress, but it wasn't a fortress of walls and towers. It was something else, something deeper. They didn't just defend the beaches, they looked past them. Because Okinawa's strength wasn't in how it looked from above, but in what lay beneath. The land itself was a weapon. In the north, the terrain was wild and thick, hills covered in jungle, deep ravines, one narrow coastal road that twisted and turned, too small for large vehicles. It was hard to move through, harder still to fight in, but it was the south that would become the graveyard. Rolling hills covered most of it. Beneath them, caves ran like hidden rivers. Formed over thousands of years, they had now been turned into bunkers, command posts, hospitals, and traps. Coral ridges stood like broken teeth, cutting across the land. Narrow paths twisted between rice fields and thick undergrowth. There were no wide battlefields here, only dead ends and choke points. And then there was the mud. Okinawa was known for its rain, and when the monsoon came, the roads vanished. The coral turned slick, trenches filled with water. Soldiers sank to their knees just trying to walk. Trucks got stuck. Tanks slid sideways into ditches. Even the best equipment meant nothing if it couldn't move. That's what made the island deadly. Not just the defenders, but the place itself. Still, the Japanese didn't rely on nature alone. They shaped the land into something cruel. They dug over 60 miles of tunnels, built bunkers into the hillsides, carved firing holes into coral, covered machine gun nests with stone. Everything was hidden. Everything is ready. And they didn't do it alone. Civilians were pulled into the war. Boys as young as 14 were forced to carry grenades. Girls were trained to be nurses or messengers. Old men dug trenches. Mothers carried ammunition. They were told never to surrender, that the Americans would torture them, that death was better than capture. And many believed it. Some were given grenades with only one instruction: use them on yourself and your family when the time comes. The North was left mostly unguarded. A thin screen of troops stood watch, but that wasn't where the real fight would be. The Japanese concentrated everything in the South, around Shuri Castle, around the ridges and caves where they could fight, fall back, and fight again. Every inch was prepared. The beaches? Almost empty, because the plan wasn't to stop the Americans from landing. The plan was to let them land, let them spread out, let them think they were winning, and then bleed them dry. Okinawa wasn't just a battlefield, it was a maze, a trap, a grave already dug. And once the Americans stepped onto its soil, there would be no clean way out, only the long walk through fire and the silence that followed. Building the trap. By the time the Americans arrived, Okinawa was already dying. The Japanese 32nd Army had spent almost a year turning it into a fortress. But this fortress didn't have high walls or wide gates. It was buried in the hills, hidden in the rock, silent and still, waiting to strike. At the center of it all was General Mitsuru Ushijima. He was quiet, careful, and calm. Unlike some of his superiors, he did not believe in glory for glory's sake. He didn't chase pointless charges or dream of victories that would never come. He knew what was coming. His job, as he saw it, was to slow the Americans down, bleed them, break them, and buy Japan time. He looked at the beaches and shook his head. Other islands had tried to stop the Americans at the water's edge. It never worked. The Americans always pushed through, always landed, always brought more. So Ushijima tried something different. He pulled his men back from the beaches and let the Americans come ashore without a fight. He kept his real forces hidden further inland, dug deep into the limestone ridges. There, the terrain would do half the killing. The rest would be done by his soldiers, who were told that death was not a possibility, it was a duty. They carved over 60 miles of tunnels beneath the ground, built pillboxes into the rock, almost invisible from the air, hid machine guns in ridges, created kill zones where American tanks would roll in and never roll out. Everything was covered, camouflaged, hardened. They didn't just dig holes, they built a system. There were layers of defense. First came the outer lines, then fallback positions, and finally the heart of it all, the Shuri line. This was the real stronghold, a stretch of ridges, caves, and concrete nests wrapped around Shuri Castle. It was the old seat of Okinawan kings. Now it would be the center of the island's slow death. The soldiers were ready, but they were not alone. Civilians, old, young, everyone were brought into the defense. Boys as young as 14 were given wooden rifles and told they were soldiers now. Girls became nurses, cooks, and runners. Others were used to carry ammunition, dig new tunnels, burn supplies to keep them from falling into American hands. Many of them didn't want to fight. Many didn't understand the war, but they were caught in it anyway. Some were forced, some believed, some simply had nowhere else to go. Posters warned them never to surrender. Leaflets said Americans would kill them all, that they would be tortured, dishonored, and shamed. Some took their own lives before the Americans even landed. Whole families walked into caves and pulled the pins on grenades together. The army also prepared suicide units. Men with bombs strapped to their chests, boats packed with explosives, planes turned into flying weapons, kamikaze. They were not expected to come back. That was the point. Even the great battleship Yamato, the pride of the Japanese Navy, was ordered on a suicide run. It had just enough fuel to reach Okinawa, not to return. Everything was built for one goal: to make the Americans pay. Pay for every inch. Pay for every step. Pay in blood. Ushijima did not believe he would win, but he believed he could matter. He believed Okinawa could scream loud enough that the world would pause before setting foot on Japan itself. He believed that pain, pure, sharp, and endless, might be enough to change the future. And so the island waited. The trap was set, and across the sea the ships were already coming, landing in silence. The Americans came on Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1945. More than 1,300 ships gathered off the western shore of Okinawa. It was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. Bigger than Normandy, bigger than anything before it. In the dark before dawn, the water churned with landing craft. Soldiers checked their rifles. Marines gripped their flamethrowers. The air was tense. Everyone expected fire. Everyone expected death. But when the first wave hit the beach at 8:30 a.m., there was nothing. No bullets, no mines, no screams, just the wind and the crash of waves. 50,000 troops landed in the first few hours. They moved quickly, cautiously, expecting an ambush at every turn. But the beach was empty. The airfields of Yantan and Kadena, so important, so carefully studied, were captured without a fight. The Americans advanced 5 kilometers inland before they saw real resistance. Some soldiers laughed nervously. Others looked around, waiting for the sky to fall, but nothing happened. Not yet. Up in the hills, the Japanese watched in silence. They let the Americans move, let them spread out, let them feel safe. Then the trap closed. It began with the hills. The ground shook as mortars rained down from the Shuri line. Artillery hidden deep in tunnels opened fire. Machine guns fired from impossible angles. The Americans couldn't see where it was coming from. They only saw their men drop. One after another, tanks moved forward and vanished, swallowed by hidden ditches, destroyed by point-blank fire from bunkers they couldn't see. The coral ground cracked beneath their weight. The mud clung to their treads. Nothing moved easily.
As it approaches the hill mass around Kakuzu, they walk into a wall of fire.
The battle for Okinawa had truly begun, and it would not end for 82 days. From the start, the land fought against the Americans. Rain soaked the ground. It poured into foxholes, turning them into swamps. It covered fields in thick mud. Rifles jammed, boots stuck. Progress slowed to a crawl. Every ridge had a name: Cactus Ridge, Sugarloaf Hill, Kakuzu, Tombstone. Names the soldiers would remember long after the war ended. Names they would wake up shouting. Behind every hill was another. Behind every cave, more tunnels. The Japanese did not flee. They waited. They endured. And when they attacked, it was with quiet rage. The worst was the silence. Soldiers spoke of how the hills seemed to breathe, how the ground whispered before it killed. There were no front lines here, only zones of death that moved with every hour. On April 6, Japan struck back hard. Over 300 kamikaze planes dove toward the ships offshore. Carriers were set on fire. Destroyers sunk. Hundreds died in a single day, and it would not be the last wave. Then came the Yamato. Japan's greatest battleship sailed straight toward Okinawa, knowing it would never return. American planes found it before it got close. They dropped bombs, fired torpedoes, and the Yamato exploded, taking nearly 2,500 men with it to the bottom of the sea. It was all part of the plan, a plan made of death. But the Americans kept coming. More troops, more supplies, more firepower. And still, the Japanese held. The Americans began to ask, how many more would have to die? What kind of victory would be left when there was no one left to cheer? The silence that welcomed them to Okinawa was gone now, replaced by screams, by fire, by the long, slow, grinding sound of hope turning into dust. The hills that ate men. By mid-April, the Americans had reached the heart of the island, and that's where the dying began in earnest. The Shuri Line was not just a line, it was a wall of death, a series of ridges, caves, and bunkers, all built into the ground like bone. Every inch of it had been planned. Every stone had been placed with purpose, and every gun waited quietly until it was time to fire. The soldiers of the U.S. 10th Army moved in, expecting a fight. They got something worse. The Japanese didn't fight to win. They fought to destroy. They didn't charge. They didn't shout. They stayed hidden, waited for a mistake, and then struck hard and fast. Snipers hid in trees. Mortars fired from tunnels. Machine gun fire came from nowhere and everywhere. The hills didn't just hide the enemy, they became the enemy. Places like Kakuzu Ridge, Tombstone Hill, and Skyline Ridge became killing grounds. American forces threw everything at them, artillery, tanks, and airstrikes. But the ground absorbed it. The Japanese would retreat deeper into the caves, wait for the shelling to stop, and then come out firing. Flamethrowers were used to clear bunkers. Napalm was dropped to flush out caves. But nothing was simple. The coral walls were thick, the tunnels deep. The enemy didn't run. They didn't surrender. They simply refused to die. On May 3rd, the Japanese launched their final major counterattack. More than 20,000 soldiers moved through the dark, slipping past American lines. They carried grenades, rifles, and sometimes just knives. Tanks rolled forward through the mud, trying to find weak spots. Explosive boats tried to sneak around the coast to attack from behind. But the Americans were ready. They had better artillery, better tanks, more planes. And now they knew the land. They had learned where the enemy hid, where they moved, where they would strike. The counterattack failed. Japanese soldiers were cut down in open fields. Suicide boats were caught before they landed. Tanks were destroyed before they reached their targets. The hills were lit with fire as American guns thundered through the night. By morning, the battlefield was covered with bodies. Some still burned, others were buried in collapsed tunnels. The Japanese had lost thousands. They had thrown everything they had left, and it wasn't enough. But the cost for the Americans was still growing. Rain fell almost every day. It turned trenches into rivers, supply roads into swamps. Soldiers marched ankle-deep in water. Their feet rotted, their weapons rusted, and all the while the hills kept killing. Shuri Castle, once the seat of Okinawa's old kings, now sat in flames. Napalm covered its stones, bombs tore its walls apart. Underneath, Japanese soldiers still held out, firing from the tunnels like ghosts in the earth. By late May, something shifted. The Shuri Line cracked. The Japanese began to fall back. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. They were out of food, out of water, out of bullets. Still, they did not surrender. They moved south toward the cliffs of Mabuni. Toward the final stand, American troops pushed after them. Slowly, carefully. Each step was dangerous. Each hill was a trap, but they moved forward, driven by orders, by rage, by the need to end it all. The hills had taken too many names lost in the mud. Too many bodies are buried where no one would ever find them. Too many boys who had landed smiling and were now silent forever. No one spoke of victory anymore, only after finishing, of surviving. And in the distance, the southern cliffs waited, and so did the last of the Japanese. Wounded, starving, but still willing to die. The battle was not over. It was only moving toward its end, slowly, one grave at a time. No way out. By June, the island was nearly dead. The Americans had broken through the Shuri Line, but there was no celebration, no cheers, no flag raised in triumph, just more walking, more rain, more dying. The Japanese had pulled back to the southern tip of Okinawa. The land there was tighter, narrow cliffs, steep slopes, caves that ran deep into the stone. It was a place made for last stands, for ending things. General Mitsuru Ushijima and his staff knew it was over. The men were starving, ammunition was gone, the wounded outnumbered the healthy, but they still fought, they still chose to die. The hills of Mabuni became the last battlefield. American troops moved forward slowly, yard by yard, flushing out bunkers, clearing caves. Sometimes there was gunfire, other times nothing at all, just a grenade rolling from the shadows. Civilians were everywhere. Many were wounded, many were hiding, some begged for help, others ran into the sea. There were no clear lines anymore, only chaos, only fear. Some of the last Japanese soldiers still believed surrender was shameful. They threw themselves from cliffs rather than be captured. Others pulled grenades close and whispered goodbye before the flash. American troops saw it all, and some of them broke, not from wounds but from watching, from being powerless to stop it. On June 21st, white flags began to appear. The shooting quieted. Inside a cave on a steep hill, Ushijima wrote a final note. Then he and General Isamu Cho knelt, drew their swords, and committed suicide. One by one, their staff followed them. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the operations officer, was ordered to live, so someone could tell the story. And so he did. The battle was declared over. But the island was not at peace. American forces searched the hills for survivors. Some Japanese soldiers kept fighting from hidden caves. Some Okinawan civilians still refused to come out. For weeks, small fights flared up, then faded. It would take months to truly silence the island. The cost was unbearable. The United States lost over 12,500 men. More than 55,000 were wounded. The Navy, hit hardest by kamikaze attacks, lost nearly 5,000 sailors. Ships had been sunk, planes shot down. Whole crews were wiped out in moments. Japan lost far more. Over 110,000 soldiers were killed. Fewer than 10,000 surrendered. Suicide was seen as a duty. Even hope had died, but it was the civilians who suffered most. At least 80,000 Okinawan men, women, and children perished. Some from bombs, some from starvation, some from fear. Others were forced into death, handed grenades, and told to make a choice. The real number may be even higher, more than 120,000, nearly a third of the island's people. The land itself was ruined, villages burned, fields scorched, entire communities erased. What was left would never be the same. But the island was now in Allied hands. The airfields were rebuilt. New ports were dug into the coast. Okinawa became a base, a fortress, a warning, the final stop before Japan. And the world began to understand the truth. If this was what it took to take one island, what would it take to invade the Japanese mainland? The answer came weeks later, not with a landing, but with a flash. But Okinawa had already said enough. Its silence still echoes. Its hills are still remembered, and the blood still lies beneath the grass. Okinawa did not heal. It was rebuilt. But healing never came. Beneath the concrete runways and military bases, the soil still holds the bones of those who died without names. The children, the farmers, the soldiers who never chose this war. For 82 days, the island screamed, and when the noise stopped, a silence deeper than peace settled in. Not victory, not defeat, just absence. Today, planes still fly overhead, troops still walk its roads, but the land does not forget. It never can. Because Okinawa was more than a battle. It was the price of reaching the end without ever finding it.